it moved so quickly between cycles as the radar went around. That was much faster than anything that we had in the inventory. And all I can say is that it was an amazing thing. The thing would fly some 3,000 to 5,000 miles an hour, would make right turns. The B-47 bombers weren't capable of going that high. They would load the SAC bombers that were on ready alert with nuclear weapons. We were in a very advanced stage of the Cold War because we were the closest thing to Russia.
Welcome to UFO Radio International, investigative podcast show about UFO phenomena. And here is your host, Giuliano Marinkovic.
This time a special episode. I started to work on this episode back in August 2017 after I interviewed the radar operators Bill Schroeder and Dennis Force regarding their radar incident above southern Florida when they detected two UFO groups. You can listen that special investigative episode in our archives. Soon after that episode, I continued to research and dig for similar cases, and I actually found article from the journalist Bill Cox, and I also found references from Bill Schroeder himself. They were mentioning another radar UFO incident that happened in 1958 above Alaska, and the main participant was Gerry Flood, GCA radar air traffic controller at the time, and he was working at Eielson Air Force Base where his radar site was located. I have also prepared a map so you could get a better glimpse about the terrain and the radar sites that were involved in this incident. You can find a link to that map in the description section of this episode. So, besides Eielson Air Force Base, there were other radar locations that were part of this case. For example, about 20 miles northwest from Eielson, there was Ladd Air Force Base in Fairbanks, where there was another GCA radar site, and approximately 50 miles north from the Eielson Air Force Base, there was a dual-line radar station. All these stations detected a UFO or unknown target that was able to fly over 5,000 miles per hour, and it was making turns instantly or over 90 degrees. All these radar sites confirmed that they have a target on their scopes. The incident itself lasted for about 4 to 5 hours, so it lasted for quite a long time. And there are similarities with Bill's case in relation to maneuvers that UFO was maintaining, the length of the incident, the speeds. Gerald's incident was concluded when a helicopter and T-33 from Ladd Air Force Base were dispatched to visually inspect the target, and he could hear over the communications that they reported that they observed only an ice cloud over the Ladd's Air Force Base power station. And that explanation seems was not related to maneuvers and performances that Gerry was able to detect on his radar. Participants involved in this incident had to write up the shift log before they signed off their shift, and Gerald states that because of the extremely secret operations conducted at Eielson Air Force Base, and you will get the glimpse about it in the upcoming interview, the participants were told not to discuss this incident any further. So it is another incident that should be put in the batch of other similar cases so we can observe and correlate the patterns. And I became very interested when I read Gerald's report that he left in 2005 on the UFO Evidence website. and it took me some effort to locate him and to contact him. And I would like to thank once again to Gerald for granting me the interview and for being so kind to fill me up with all the details. He was quite a gentleman. So in a minute, interview with Gerry Flood, a radar incident about Alaska in 1958.
The Air Force radar network is watching for strange flying objects reported in various sections of the country. The Air Force alerted its radar installations after sightings of unidentified flying objects were reported in the Gulf of Mexico, Texas, and the Missile Test Center in New Mexico and in other areas of the country.
Hello everyone, and today we have another special guest who was participant in a very important radar incident during the 50s. Before we delve deeper into case, which has a lot of interesting and technical details of radar capabilities at the time and unknown aerial phenomena, I would like for Gerry to represent himself, his biography to us and his military career so we could have better perspective of his responsibilities at the time. So Gerry, the mic is yours.
My name is Gerry Flood. I live in Royal Oak, Michigan. I'm 79 years old. And as a young man, I went in the Air Force when I was 18 years old. In 1956, the Air Force, after basic training, trained me as an air traffic controller at Keesler Air Force Base, where I specialized as a GCA operator. The GCA operations was local control of airplanes during bad weather, where we were handed off an aircraft that was in the area. We directed them around the pattern and gave them a final approach in bad weather under radar conditions, which they were not able to land on their own. After basic training and GCA training, I was sent to my first assignment at Elmendorf Air Force Base in Anchorage, Alaska, and was there for approximately 6 months before being transferred to Eielson Air Force Base near Fairbanks, Alaska. Eielson Air Force Base was I forget the name of the command, Alaskan Air Command, but it was a base that had Strategic Air Command bombers and reconnaissance aircraft. We had the Air Defense Command B-66 bombers, which were there for supposedly photomapping Alaska. And then we were, from time to time, visited by 3 or 4 U-2 aircraft, which, as I think everyone knows what their objective was. And, of course, to me as a 20-year-old, they were amazing and a brand new experience to see and understand what these aircraft could do. In any case, I became a qualified GCA operator at Eielson Air Force Base and also did part-time duties in the control tower. So I was well aware of all air traffic control operations in the area. In Alaska at that time, you also had what they called air defense zones, which were long-distance radar that was set up to distant early warning of aircraft coming in from Russia at those days of the Cold War. And so we were completely surrounded in Alaska by a ring of distant early warning sites, radar sites in 2 or 3 bands, far north, middle north, and then, of course, the local radar for air traffic control. And so I was stationed there until 1958 and then moved to King Salmon Air Force Station in the outer part of Alaska, and then to Selfridge Air Force Base in the Detroit, Michigan area, and then transferred finally to Lowry Air Force Base in Denver, Colorado, where I completed my 4 years of Air Force duty.
Mm-hmm. Regarding incident itself that we will talk today, we can maybe go through the configuration of sites that will be important in this case. So, as you said, you were located in Eielson Air Force Base, and I think on the northwestern side, about 20 miles, there was a lead Army airfield, right? And on the northern side, you also had Dewey Line radar site too, like you already said, which was part of distant early warning line to try to detect any possible attempt of Soviet intrusions from the North Pole and from that area, right?
Yes, that's correct. It was quite a complete. I mean, we relied entirely before the days of satellites on the radar network to warn us of bombers coming across from the North Pole to attack Canada and the United States.
Regarding your site itself, can you describe to us type of equipment that you maintained, and especially the radar and the capabilities?
Well, I had trained in a GCA was typically in most places set up with a trailer next to the active runway, where they combine both surveillance radar and precision approach radar. In Eielson Air Force Base, they had remoted the trailer was out next to the runway, and they were able to, I guess, by cables, remote the scopes and the radios to nearby to the basement of our headquarters. I was in what they call the Airways and Air Communication Service. And so we had what they called an MPN-11, which was probably an advanced radar set for the time, given that it had been developed during World War II, used extensively during the Berlin airlift, which I believe actually made the Berlin airlift possible. And then we had that upgrade called the MPN-11. And we were able to have surveillance radar for approximately 50-mile area from zero elevation up to about 60,000 feet. Our precision approach radar was lined up directly to the active runway that was going to be used for planes landing on the base. So the two types of radar, the surveillance radar gave us a 360-degree view of the area. And in this case, the incident occurred in using that radar rather than the precision approach radar on final approach.
Yeah, you also had wider range with that, so which was allowing you to detect the phenomenon that we will talk about. We can now go into the incident itself. Do you recall the date, the year when it happened? I recorded this in 2005 because I realized that my age, I was beginning to lose the details or make up what I think I remembered. But it was approximately January, February 1958 in the wintertime. I know that, and it was on the midnight shift when I was working from. We maintained radar 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so it was a midnight shift I worked, and we had two other people on shift. I was a airman third class, and there was probably another airman third class or airman first class, along with a sergeant on duty. So there was the three of us on duty. And of course, the midnight shift was rather standby, basically, because unless we were alerted that something was coming in and we would have been notified ahead of time, you pretty much just waited for some incident to occur, some
somebody to call to say that there was an aircraft coming in. So it was pretty rather boring to sit there all night. And, of course, we couldn't sleep. We were on duty. And so from time to time, we would just look at the radar scope for no other reason, I guess, than to keep from falling asleep. And so it was sometime after 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, as I recall, that the incident occurred.
Oh, yeah. We can go now into the beginning of the incident itself. So, yeah, let's hear this really, really interesting beginning of the whole case, how you were able to notice that something strange was starting to happen.
Well, like I say, we would be sitting there, and I think, as I recall, it was myself sitting there while the other two were reading or doing something, and just I guess I'd read all the magazines, so I was looking at the scope and just playing with the adjustments just to see what it could, just I guess to kill time. So in any case, as the surveillance radar made its 360 degrees cycle, the radar was set up to what they call cancel out non-moving targets. The idea being that if you removed targets that didn't move after one cycle, you could focus on what was moving. And that allowed you to have a clearer picture. It was pretty good for the time, if you think about it. So in any case, you were watching around, I was watching around, and something stood out. And I believe I was northwest of where I was, northwest of Fairbanks. And it was a blip that didn't go away the second time around. And so I was pretty familiar with the radar topography there, having done this now for several months, and what was and wasn't clear on the screen. So this kind of got my attention. So I looked again, and it continued to move. So I called the others. I said, well, there's something happening out here. But it wasn't anything unusual until we started following it, and it moved so quickly between cycles as the radar went around. That was much faster than anything that we had in the inventory. And again, as I said, we were looking at advanced aircraft there. It was cold weather testing for the Century Series fighters, where we had F-100, F-105. And then we had the U-2. We had the most advanced aircraft coming and going in there. So it was pretty new to me that this was not something that we were aware of. Well, then as the 2 or 3 of us now started watching, it would make absurdly right turns or left turns, in any case, 90-degree turns that were just not seem possible for anything to be able to do. And to continue to figure out what was going on, we were able to raise or lower the antenna up to our maximum height of about 50,000, 60,000 feet, 20 or 30 miles, I forget what it was exactly, out. And so we watched this thing going in these erratic movements, or stopping and then starting. It would disappear from time to time because the radar would cancel it out if it didn't move. But it obviously it kept coming back, so that we were watching all this. So now it became something that, since we hadn't heard anybody else reporting it, that we were want to confirm was actually occurring, and not just a malfunction or something in our radar. So we called the Distant Early Warning site, and they were able to confirm it. And then we called, it was Ladd Air Force Base at the time, was also another forward fighter base. And they, of course, had been on standby, so they started looking for it, and then saw it and reported they saw it. And then the anti-aircraft guns, which were still in use to hopefully knock down Russian bombers, they were radar controlled, and so they turned the radar on, and they were following it. And we knew these guns were pretty accurate because they would show us how they would track a car going down the highway with a cannon. So we knew that, they were capable of tracking this also. So by the time we alerted everybody, 3 or 4 other nearby radar sites, everyone was watching this thing. And under the Air Force rules, the first contact was the main controller. So that was us. And so we didn't turn it over to anybody else. We kept coordinating it and writing the reports down. And we were supposed to write a log, of course, of all of this as things occurred. And so, of course, we kept a log, and the 3 of us observed what was going on. And all I can say is that it was an amazing thing. The thing would fly some 3,000 to 5,000 miles an hour, would make right turns, was at different altitudes. Now, we couldn't accurately track the altitude other than in general, but we knew it was as high as 50, 60,000 feet. And the only thing we had that could go that high was the U-2, which we knew did that, but the bombers and the B-47 bombers weren't capable of going that high. So it was pretty clear that this was not something that we had in the U.S. inventory as far as we knew. What we didn't know was, of course, if it was some kind of a Russian vehicle or a Russian machine. But it made no threats, and it didn't do anything other than this erratic flying around for several hours. And we kept writing it down and reporting it and getting reports from all the other radar stations. So this occurred probably from 1 o'clock till about 3 or 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. I don't really recall anymore exactly, but it was a long night.
Yeah, and in your report that you submitted to UFO Evidence website, you mentioned that it was approximately 4 hours. And the details are absolutely remarkable. And I'm saying that because a few weeks ago, I interviewed another former radar operator, Bill Schroeder, and I think he also talked with you at some point in the past. And actually the similarities between the two incidents are quite staggering, and they are showing us some patterns. For example, he also tracked on the southern Florida side 4 unknown targets that approached also with similar high speeds up to 5,000 miles per hour. Then they deaccelerated, and they were also moving in 90-degree turns. He also recalls that they will be sometimes visible by radar, sometimes they would disappear. So this is really very, very similar to his case, which is also giving some additional pattern. I wanted to also check this feature. Was the 5,000 miles per hour actually the limitation of the radar system, that this is the maximum speed that could be detected? Because I recall that was in Bill's case too.
Well, the thing is, we had rings of circles that were at 5-mile intervals out to the limit of our radar. And so when it would be traveling between the rings, and we could pretty much measure the interval that it would take to go from the 20-mile to the 25-mile ring. And that was how we were able to roughly guess the speed.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I'm saying we were, these were approximations based on obviously our training and our understanding of our equipment that enable us to calculate it. And we did this obviously for landing aircraft, because they would have certain speeds that they would land at. Of course, we understood all those. So it was fairly easy to get a close approximation of the speed they were going.
This also aspect of raising and lowering down the antenna, that was used for expanding the range, right? Were there also possibilities to correctly measure the altitude of targets?
Well, only the only thing, as I recall, is when we normally did not have the radar at that extreme height because it was typically no aircraft within a very close range that would concern us, that would be at above, 15, 20,000 feet. So when an aircraft was within that range and it would disappear, we said, well, is it because it's, higher or lower? So that's when we would raise the antenna up and found that we could see it again at the higher altitudes.
Oh, yeah. I see, yeah. So when you actually raise the antenna, then you are getting the enlarged zone in the sense of the altitude. That is the way how you sort of approximately measure then, right?
Yeah. So we didn't know exactly the height, but we knew if we brought the antenna down, didn't see it anymore, we kind of had an angle of what it was and how the distance. So that gave us a rough idea of altitude.
Oh, how the communication went with other sites? So there was a lead Army airfield in the network. We had dual line radar 50 miles to the north. Oh, and you also mentioned you had anti-aircraft or radar guns. Can you tell us something more about these radar guns and capabilities that you could use at your site? For example, in Bill Schroeder's Radar UFO Incident that happened in 1967, they had illuminator radar that was used to navigate the missile. However, how the situation looked at your side at that point in time, in 1958?
Well, they were actually no missiles at those days. This was anti-aircraft. They were capable of, shooting down aircraft if they were within the altitude. But they did have a radar tracking on them, because it was obviously the only way you could accurately track an aircraft at high speed was to have some method of correcting the aim of the guns. So yes, they were there for that purpose. It was Fort Richardson, I believe. It was very close to our base where we could drive over. It was adjoining our base where the Army was stationed, and that's where those weapons were. And then the dual line site, like I said, was about 50 miles away. And then Fairbanks, Alaska was about 40 miles up the Alcan Highway, which is now Fairbanks International Airport.
Oh, yeah. So you detected the phenomenon and other radar sites were able to confirm it. What was the feeling in the room, the type of radio traffic? Was there any excitement? Has anyone considered to scramble maybe jets?
Well, given the Cold War and the fact that this was what we were all ready for, I guess one of the things now, especially since you contacted me, was to wonder why and how the distant early warning radar station, which probably had a couple 100-mile range and way more capability than us, didn't see it before we did, and didn't unless I thought, well, maybe one of the answers is maybe they knew what it was and were keeping it because they had an understanding of what it was. We're keeping it, and I kind of. By seeing it and announcing it, maybe it was something they weren't going to talk about, and I inadvertently saw it, or because they had. I mean, if you remember, or maybe I remember, the distant early warning sites were set up to get an advance warning of these. So why they didn't see it before I did is now really concerning me in terms of how we saw it first. But in any case, when we did see it and reported it to the other radar stations, they all confirmed it. And so that was the thing. And then the distant early warning site was kind of a routine, treated it routine. I mean, would report back to us where it was or what they saw or confirm what we were seeing. And the radar station at the GCA site at LAD was the same way. They were just, more routine. I think I was the more excited one, or we were the more excited one, because we had, from where we were, we thought we had the big picture. We were watching it and had watched it for hours.
Regarding the overall configuration of bases there in Alaska, I think I was also reading Bill Koch's article that also devoted one piece to your case, because there is also some pattern between UFO incidents and nukes. I'm wondering, was there anything like that in that wider range, that we had any nukes there?
Well, the B-47 Strategic Air Command medium bombers were stationed there, and we had when I worked in the control tower at nights, they would load the SAC bombers that were on ready alert with nuclear weapons. So, we were in a very advanced stage of the Cold War, because we were the closest thing to Russia. And of course, the B-66 bombers were, whatever they claimed they were doing, they were actually entering Soviet airspace. And the U-2s, of course, would leave for 8-hour missions, flying east, and come back 8 hours later from the north. So, it was no secret to the people on the base that we were there to penetrate and to observe and to be ready should there be an incident with the Soviet Union.
Oh, it was pretty much active zone.
Right.
Yeah. Regarding the incident itself, we are now going to sort of the resolution or the end. So how the whole situation developed in the end?
Well, like I said, we would just, as the evening or the morning wore on and we got closer to, I think, 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, the sightings became somewhat less, and it appeared that the thing was stationary. And of course, that meant that it was disappearing, and then it would reappear. So it wasn't consistent, I guess, that we were seeing it as later in the morning. And so Ladd Air Force Base, why they did a T-33, which of course, the best plane they had at the time there was an F-89, Northrop F-89, equipped with wing pods full of rockets. So evidently nobody saw it as a threat. So they just sent the T-33 up and a helicopter up, because it looked like it was hovering over the base at Ladd. So the T-33 went up and couldn't, as we found out, reported nothing. And the helicopter said that it appeared to be an ice cloud over the power plant there. And in those days, the power plant was coal-fired, so there would have been heat rising from the stack. And none of that made any sense. But then again, I was a low-ranking airman, and I was told that was what it was, and my shift was coming to an end. So it was pretty much, I accepted what they said. I didn't have any alternative to come up with. And so that was pretty much the end of it. When it was now 7 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, it was the end of our shift. We had all the logs filled out with what had occurred. And then when we thought it was something to talk about, we were told that, that just not to say anything. And given, again, what was going on at that base with the U-2s, and I had a top secret clearance. I couldn't take any pictures. I couldn't tell people at home, other than in general, what was going on anyway. So, of course, when they said not to talk about this, that was consistent with what I understood was a requirement of my clearance in the Air Force.
Yeah, sure. Regarding that end and the helicopter and T-33 that were dispatched, Where was actually the last radar contact? Was it also above Ladd Air Force Base? Did you actually still had radar contact while they were closing in to that position?
No, the helicopter said it was an ice cloud, and of course, I don't even know that if it was an ice cloud stationary, we wouldn't have been able to even see it because the radar would have canceled it out. It didn't move, and so I couldn't verify or not verify what they were talking about from where I was, 30 miles away. That was right at the extreme edge of our radar. As to the T-33, I could watch him, and I could see where he was going, but he just kind of went in the general direction that was the last reported. They were all in the north to northwest of where we were, which would have put them probably to the west of Ladd Air Force Base, directly due west of Ladd Air Force Base. If you triangulate, which was northwest of us, would have been east or west to them.
And like you said, I guess this characteristic that objects were at the moment stationary and then they would travel again, I guess in relation to the radar equipment, that really shows a problem to get continuous following of the path, right? So this stationary filter actually to give you better oversight of the usual targets in this situation actually presented a problem.
Right, we couldn't turn it off.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't have done us any good because then any stationary targets would have merged into the background of the ground clutter.
Exactly. So it will be a lot of noise.
A lot of noise.
Yeah. After the incident, and like you said, there was not more chat about it, but did you hear anything similar, some other correlating cases maybe during your Air Force career?
Well, not directly, but as part of our training it was Operation Blue Book, I believe was the code name for it. All control towers that I was worked in, and every one of them for the 4 years I was in the Air Force, all had dual lens 35 millimeter cameras that we were instructed on how to use should there be a visual sighting. And I was very skeptical. I mean, I knew if the trained air traffic controllers or pilots, I gave them credibility if anything occurred. But personally, I never heard any more from anybody else, and I never discussed it again, other than when I was at Lowry Air Force Base at the end of my career. I happened a chance to get a ride in a helicopter. And it was just one of these things where we were often able to get flights, and it supposedly was helped our training as air traffic controllers to get in the pilot's perspective. So I got a ride in a helicopter, and when I mentioned about the incident in Alaska, the last time I had anything to do with the helicopter, it turned out one of the pilots of the helicopter had been the pilot of the helicopter in Alaska. And other than just laughing about it, didn't discuss it any further. So that was pretty much the end of my discussing this with anybody until I made this written version of it and ended up talking to Bill Schroeder. And it was only, I guess, the fact that we didn't have a visual sighting of anything, but rather what we believed was an absolutely unmistakable contact through radar that, I believe in these type of sightings.
Yeah.
I guess you can't call them a sighting.
More like a detection through electronic means. Yeah, definitely. And there are lots of cases. My God, how many air traffic crews I also interviewed. Although I do think the exceptional cases have sort of a rare appearance. Otherwise, we would discuss this topic quite differently now. but there is sort of a pattern under the layer but the problem is the frequency of these cases, the geographical distribution, and then it's harder to connect the dots, and nobody then wants to invest any energy in it unless we have sort of a reappearing frequency, which rarely happens. And I saw in your in the Billy Cox article that he devoted some piece to your case, that through years you also read some UFO cases, but again, there is a lot of noise, unfortunately, in this field, and it is refreshing when we have really direct insight with technical capabilities. But was there also your feelings on that line that unfortunately there is a lot of noise, and that is all sort of led you to write up the report so it could be there for the record?
Well, the other thing is, as I read all of the Operation Blue Book and all of the sightings that I saw in Alaska, I read every one of them that I could find, especially during the 50s and 60s, just to see if there was any other radar sightings. And all I could find was the visual sightings. And it just, I believe in my heart 100% that I saw what I saw, that I experienced what I experienced. And I don't have that same feeling when I read about visual sightings, other than the 90% of them, 95% of them, other than somebody who's either a trained observer or pilot, cop, or a air traffic controller. That narrows it down to just a few that I even begin to give credibility to, but I never saw anywhere that were radar sightings, which to me were 100% valid, except the one I talked to Bill Schroeder, and he was telling me, and then the author of that book had a few others, and now you're bringing it up, that there was, a few of these, but they made sense, and I'd like to know where the big picture was. I know what I saw, and I know what I experienced, and it's kind of hard to talk to other people about it without being thought of as harebrained as somebody like Bill Schroeder, or somebody who had my background or a similar background and knew what I was talking about, and I knew what he was talking about.
I completely agree 100%. And like you said, these I would say like civilian sightings or visual sightings are mostly, sure, statistically something could be done, but if you want to narrow down your focus and energy to go deeper, then it's a sort of, on the other hand, waste of energy unless somebody is really making statistical observations. But like you said, radar detections and aeronautical incidents, I think also with good selection of these, then you sort of go to get closer to the phenomena itself. It's hard to do it. Definitely hard to do it. It's a very remarkable case, Gerry, and maybe we could talk a little bit now shortly about more routine things. How was the routine day looking when you two was doing these flights? I guess this is also a very interesting footnote of the Cold War, and it was really great that you were a part of it, so maybe you can talk a little bit about that shortly too.
Well, I didn't really appreciate the fact that they sent me to Alaska. I'm from Winnipeg, Manitoba, so going to Alaska was more like a punishment. And I didn't, a whole lot of the 4 years in the Air Force was kind of like secondary duties, maintaining your living area, doing KP, stuff like that, was kind of detracted from what we thought was a pretty good job. And when I was doing it really intensely in some areas where, at Selfridge, I was able to, at one point with another controller, in an emergency, bring in 14 aircraft. I would take the first and third, he'd take the second and fourth, and we would bring them in because they were all minimum fuel. And those are the incidents that I remember that really made it worthwhile. I also got to send the President of the United States to California when he really didn't want to go, because as a GCA operator, I was on duty in Maui Air Force Base when President Eisenhower would visit there often. And because the radar, something to do with the voltage, I'm not a technician, but it couldn't properly align it. The president was scheduled to land there, and I had to tell him that the radar was not operable, and so he had to divert to California. Of course, the next day there were two colonels there to ask me what was going on and what I had done, and of course, turned out I was blameless, and I got two brand new diesel generators there, so that the next time the president came in, that there wouldn't be any diversion. So there's many incidents over the 4 years where I really look back now and I said, boy, that was pretty special for a 18 to 22-year-old kid to be involved in. You know, certainly a lot of responsibility that you don't see happening in 18-year-olds at this point. And so the Air Force gave me an opportunity to really do very responsible things very young, in a meaningful way. I mean, I enjoyed that. Now I look back and I think that was one of the highlights of my life, that I, really never happened after. A lot of things happened, but nothing personally to the extent that gave me the pleasure that doing that did, and understanding actually after the fact that it was pretty cool. It's pretty cool to talk a jet in at 190 miles an hour, and he relies on you to get him down in bad weather. It was pretty cool to talk to a U-2 pilot and who just completed a spy mission and was ordering pizza on his way in. So there was a lot of good things that kind of stick,
Absolutely, and I really like this event with the president that happened, so I guess there is a footnote in the history about that too. I also saw after your military career that you were semi-retired and you went into fire suppression company business. And I saw also on social media while I was researching and trying to locate you, it took me some effort, that really people respect you very much, that you are sort of really authoritative in that field. And I even noticed that you testified in front of the US Congress regarding fire suppression after the famous ValueJet tragedy. The accident happened on May 1996 when ValueJet DC-9, after taking off from Miami, crashed into Everglades on the southern part of Florida. And the result was a fire in the cargo compartment. So maybe you can talk also a little bit about that. I think that's also important so we could get overall picture of your career.
Well, yes, I had a quite varied career. I ended up working for finance companies for several years until I became an insurance salesman with the Auto Club of Michigan, selling personal insurance for about 20 years. And for some reason, the entrepreneurial bug bit me, or I always had it, or I always wanted to be my own boss. And so I left that to get into alternative fuels, and thinking that there was going to be a future in propane and natural gas powered vehicles. And for about 5 years, that looked like that was going to happen. And then for some reason, the gas prices didn't go up to justify that business. And so I moved on working for another gentleman who was a multimillionaire with a number of business assets. And so he gave me different positions to test out for him to see if they were viable. And one of them was a fire extinguisher company he owned that was mismanaged. And so he asked me to see if I could do anything with it. And I took it over and actually operated it for a number of years. And during the course of that time, I was asked in Congress to testify on the ValueJet experience, because it was quite a tragedy that we thought could have been prevented, or we had an opinion on that could have been prevented. And in the course of preparing for congressional testimony, it's like a legal trial. There are no questions asked during the in front of a committee that they don't already know the answer to. No surprises. And so I said interrogated, not interviewed, by the congressional liaison officer. And the one question he asked me was, would my fire suppression have put out that fire on the value jet? Now, I realized that it was oxygen generators that were 3,500 degrees. And so I kind of hesitated, knowing that this was going to be the definitive moment of my, whether I was going to testify in Congress or not. And so he put his finger in my face and said, I'm asking you a question. Would you have put out that fire? And all I could respond, the best answer was, I said, I can't be certain, but I'd have done a better job than anyone else. He said, okay, that's fine. So given that was the evidently the answer that was okay, we were then scheduled to testify. And I was sat there with the two other employees of my company while we testified and answered the questions of the lead to a lot of work for our company, and it didn't. Well, all we did was highlight the problem, and the bigger companies that had more capability and research money basically entered the picture. The end result was that there still is, and never was, any viable fire suppression systems effective on cargo planes to this. And since then, now we're looking at the lithium-ion battery issues, and I have worked with and have now three patents since my 75th birthday, two granted, and one pending, on various solutions for fire suppression. But I now focus on consulting with companies who are interested in using lithium-ion technologies in their products. So we've worked for motorcycle companies, we've worked for electric vehicle companies, we've worked for drone and unmanned aerial vehicle companies. We worked for companies who recycle phones, where they taking the batteries out of tens of thousands of phones causes fire. So there's plenty for me to do now in the lithium-ion battery business, because they consistently have issues now that no one is able to come up with a total solution for how do you deal with these battery fires that occur in cigarettes, cameras, phones, cars, all types of things that are powered by batteries. So that's what I do now.
What an amazing and rich career! Really, that was really interesting to hear. And I think ValueJet, after the incident, the airplanes were actually grounded, right, for some time, and that was quite a huge affair back in '90s when that happened.
That changed. That caused. I was also then appointed to the FAA Cargo Bay Committee to look at solutions. I was on that committee for a couple of years to look at how to deal with cargo bay solutions and fires that occur in cargo bays. And again, there's been some hit or miss solutions, but there is no real protection in the cargo bay of an aircraft for these kinds of fires. Now, they just try and restrict the cargo, and they have to be aware of what the cargo is. But they even think that one of the possibilities of the Malaysian airliner disappearance was the fact that it was carrying, I believe, about 800 pounds of brand new lithium-ion batteries. And until they recovered or solved the issue of the Malaysian Airlines disappearance, that's one of the issues that remains a possible cause of that aircraft being lost.
And you know that area of potential cause of the fire by batteries generally in aviation. Can you speak a little bit more about that potential and possible problems that could be caused by that?
the whole picture with lithium-ion batteries is that we're so dependent on them in so many different ways.
Yeah.
And the actual occurrences of a fire are relatively rare, but when they are, they're pretty severe. So it's the market is driving it and says, okay, we'll deal with it later if we ever deal with it.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my God. Yeah. Yeah. Great, Gerry. It was quite an honor to talk with you. And for the end, when you now look back to your incident and overall case, what are your current feelings? Do you think a lot about that night? How are your feelings after so many years?
Well, it's still a mystery to me, and I still believe 100% that it occurred the way I've best been able to describe it. And I certainly felt much better when I talked to Bill, and as you're confirming, that there were some other connected, and it was when I talked to Bill and I can tell when I'm talking to someone who has a background in it that he knows what he's talking about. And that was what made me feel much better and made me feel better about my own version, as I was talking to somebody who experienced pretty much the same thing the same way. And it wasn't made up. It was, you had to know certain things to be able to tell the story properly. And Bill's story rang true to me. And I'm sure you're finding that there may be some other ones, hopefully. I'd like to hear about more of them.
Yeah, there definitely are. Although, as I said, they are not so sort of frequent, but when they are digged up, you could sort of connect the dots. But that is the problem, because the noise is so huge, and then why we sort of, this phenomena is still under the layer of proper research, which is really unfortunate. And cases like yours represent a core of the phenomena. Hopefully, once in the future, somebody will be able to reconstruct the issue with these raw data that should be collected now. So I want to thank you so much for that, Gerry.
Okay, well, I hope I'm around when that data is, and they can come to a good conclusion on it.
I'm hoping to. I'm definitely hoping to. I'm into it now for about 21 years, but sometimes I'm becoming pessimistic too, although I'm still optimist. But as years go through, you see sometimes that it's not going into the direction and with the speed like it should, but definitely still optimistic. So let's hope it will be useful and we will be able to. Yeah. Thank you so much, Gerry. It was such a pleasure to talk with you, and I'm sending you best of the wishes to your side of the planet.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Gerry.